Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of USBC's programming. Today we're joined by a very special group of people from our newest corporate partner, Live Oak Bank. And Live Oak Bank is here to present a very special training for us on growth through acquisition. And in growth through acquisition, we have our very most talented representatives from Live Oak Bank are going to cover some very valuable information to help your businesses grow through acquisition. Many of us don't feel like we have opportunities to consider acquisition, M&A type activities, but this is going to be a webinar that's going to help us to consider that in the future. And I'm joined by four of the very best from Live Oak Bank. They are Erin Andrew, Yara Garme, Amber Sierra, and Eric Rabinovich. So I am going to ask them to go ahead and get started with sharing their webinar content. And while we're getting started, I'm going to ask all of our folks that are just joining us and that are going to join us throughout the presentation to share a little bit about your business. Let us know where you're located, which chambers you're associated with, what city and state you're located in, and then some of those questions that you have for our Live Oak Bank representative. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my good friends over at Live Oak Bank.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. Looking forward to hearing where some folks are from, if you like to use that chat function. And of course, Q&A, we'll be monitoring Q&A and adding that into the discussion, as well as there'll be time at the end. So if you are inspired by a question, by all means, submit it through that Q&A function. So this is growth through acquisition, our presentation. So as Philip mentioned, this is our team. Erin, Amber, Eric, and Yared will be speaking with you today. So my name is Amber Sierra, and it's a pleasure to kick off this webinar. All right, so I just kind of wanted to start with an overview. We think of just the statistics or the status of Black-owned businesses in the US, and then also our current environment, right? So we're thinking about, when you're thinking of buying an acquisition, another interesting idea you might want to think about is that as of May 2021, 34% of small businesses were closed across the nation. And so, whereas that stats is evolving and changing and present day, it's just an idea to think about as you're thinking of acquiring. There may actually be more businesses available to purchase than folks just looking to exit. So just something to think in mind. And then also, one of the things that I think is really interesting as well is in the Small Business Administration, the SBA 70 loan program. In that portfolio, about 3% Black entrepreneurs make up that total 29% of minority business owners. And at Live Oak Bank, we are the #1 lender of the 70 loan program. And so we find this very important, timely topic to not only learn how to leverage 7A for acquisition, for M&A transactions, but also what can we do as a bank to be a little more intentional to make sure that number gets represented, better represented. And so just all these different things to think in mind of how Live Oak and some of the needs in the marketplace are coming together that you can take to your advantage for M&A.
Great, thank you. So Amber mentioned, should I buy a company for growth? And this is an issue that we work with many entrepreneurs on, leveraging that SBA 7A loan. And I think to the point made earlier, especially, as we're in the middle of COVID and as we kind of come out of it, there will be an opportunity and a need to grow and a need to transition wealth. There'll be companies small businesses looking to retire, and those looking to grow through expansion. So really understanding what you need to do to acquire and how the financing works will be very important. And we're going to hear from our two loan officers, Eric and Yared, in a little bit about how to do that. But I first wanted to make the point of why it's important, why acquisition can help you leverage as a company. By leveraging an SBA 7A loan, a small business acquirer can turn an initial $300,000, investment. So you put a down payment down, and you can turn that into nearly $4.5 million over the course of 5 years, assuming modest growth and stable operations. And so this equates to a 72% IRR and a 15 times multiple on invested capital, which is an incredible amount. So not only are we helping folks in a community with the transition of wealth and buying companies, you are also able to really leverage a smaller amount of money to then grow and acquire a firm that will reap benefits and profits in the future. So if you go to the next slide, this is important. So it's easier and quicker to take something good and make it great. So if you have something that already has infrastructure, a firm that you're buying that already has infrastructure that will save you on some of the business development costs or other investments in a firm, that's why acquisition could be good. And it does take small businesses some time to become profitable. So if you're able to buy a company that is already profitable, that will help you accelerate growth a little more quickly. And then there's some other things to consider when you're looking to acquire. You can acquire a competitor in the marketplace. You can decrease the amount of time and money spent on business development. I hear often as folks are looking to grow, they want to buy, they want to find a chief growth officer or even a business development person. If you buy an existing company that already has that, that also can save you in the long run, because you're not only paying that amount of money for that person, you're also buying the profits of an existing company. And then number 3, to access ongoing and existing revenues and cash you can use to grow. So if there are already profits and revenues coming off of the company you're buying, you're going to be able to reinvest that going forward. So just some things to think about. It is a tool in the toolbox. It isn't for everyone, but it is something that is an important tool that can help you with growth, and one that often is overlooked by a lot of small businesses. So we're just wanting to talk through how that works and then what it looks like from a financing perspective. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric and Erin, who will be working on the financing side.
Great, thank you, Erin. And I just want to say thanks again to Philip and the team at the US Black Chamber. We're really excited about this partnership and hopefully educating a lot of the members on being able to use this option for business growth and expansion. So with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about just some more details around the 7A process, the loan process. What does getting a loan with Live Oak look like? We'll talk about some of the eligibility criteria and how we at Live Oak Bank approach the decisioning process. How do we evaluate borrowers in terms of their credit worthiness, and how does it look like when a loan gets approved, and just walk through that process in some more detail. And I just want to reiterate before we dive into it, Amber mentioned this, but we'll have time at the end for questions. But as I'm going through this and the rest of the team, as we're discussing this, feel free, if there's something on the slide that's pulled up or something that we're talking about that doesn't make sense, or you want us to expand more on it, feel free to submit a question. We prefer to do it in real time. We want to make sure everything we're talking about makes sense and give folks the opportunity to ask questions. So with that being said, Amber, if you could just go to the next slide. So the business acquisition process, this is a very high level overview of what it looks like. But the first thing I want to mention is before you even get started, so we are bankers, Live Oak Bank obviously makes loans, and in the context of this presentation, we're talking about purchasing another business, but we're not the only team member who's going to be involved here. And it's really important that if you're considering buying a business, that you have a good attorney, particularly one who has experience with business acquisitions, and also a CPA. They're going to help with preparing financials, also with perhaps even reviewing the financials of a target business that you're considering buying. And we're going to benefit from that as well on the banking side, because of course, we're going to be asking for financials from both you, both personally, and if you operate a business currently, your current business. And it's always better if you have your books in order. And once we get a little bit further in the process, I think that's where the attorney would be valuable, because you're going to be, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but there's going to be a letter of intent that you'll have to prepare. There's a purchase agreement, if you progress to the point of actually putting an offer in on a business. So we're but one of multiple really critical team members that you're going to want to rely on and really have to rely on for this to work out and to be successful. That being said, we can, depending on where you're located, we've recommended CPAs, attorneys. So depending on, we don't always have a recommendation, but depending on the nature of the business and where you're located, we might be able to make a referral. Moving on, once we're past that, the other thing we're going to want to do early on is just exploring what the financing options are. We're going to want to know, based off of the unique aspects of your business, that's going to impact and inform how we structure the loan. And we're going to do that in a way that benefits both the buyer and the seller. So next, we're going to talk about, and it flows from the next or the previous point, we're going to talk about what is a reasonable purchase price. That's going to really depend on a number of factors, but depending on the industry, the most common metric or function of evaluating the worth of a business typically comes from earnings. It's typically a multiple of earnings, but we're going to look at historical performance, projections, the local market, the industry. Obviously, COVID has impacted a lot of businesses over the last 20 months. So, depending on the business, that's going to weigh heavily into our approach, and also how you interact with a potential seller. But that's also going to lead, ultimately you're going to land on a purchase price. And that's going to be a really fundamental step that occurs and should occur early in the process. And that's going to, as I said, that's going to be based on asset values, revenues. And once you're able to turn that corner, that's typically when you get to the point of signing a letter of intent or an LOI. And keep in mind, we're going through this at a very high level. Of course, each of these has a lot of sub steps, but this just gives you a good overarching view of what the process will look like. Assuming you can get to an LOI and the seller accepts that, and you have a tentative agreement to move forward, that's when we're really going to start looking to secure the financing. Now, up until this point, we may have at the bank, what's typical is we would have already done an initial or cursory review of your finances, the high level numbers of the business that you're considering purchasing, and basically put together a pre-qualification letter. It's at this point, though, after an LOI has been submitted, that we're going to submit the deal for underwriting. And that's when really a deep dive is conducted by our underwriting team, where they look through the tax returns, seller tax returns, buyer tax returns, personal tax returns of the buyer. Well, I'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of what we looked at. But really that, at this point, we're trying to get the loan approved. And we're also going to, of course, look at financials, year-to-date income, balance sheet, projections, and you'll also have an opportunity to conduct your own due diligence as well. And that's also where your attorney would provide some guidance through that process. We at the bank, of course, we're going to be evaluating if the business can cash flow such to the extent that it will cover the loan amount. But of course, there's other factors you as a business owner are going to want to look into. You're going to want to determine, of course, if the owners are staying on, do they have key relationships that are crucial to the business? There's just a lot of factors that go into it. So this is the time to really, not just for us at the bank, but also for you as a potential business owner, a new owner of the business, to do your due diligence and see if there's any red flags or anything that might make you want to walk away. And of course, if we find anything, we're going to be in very close communication with you throughout the process to make sure that everyone is set up for success. Oh, go ahead, Erin.
No, and Eric, well, go ahead. We just had a question I wanted to kind of pose to you that came through. So first, Ken Evans from the Urban Chamber, president in Las Vegas. Thank you for highlighting that you have some members that are interested. Definitely, we'll have our contact information at the end of this, so you can send them our way, or we're happy to talk to anyone who's looking at acquisition or looking to exit and trying to figure out what to do. So definitely want to make that. But I think there was a question from Purple Ink Marketing, startup media company interested in the viability of growing through M&A. How early should you acquire, I think was the question, and how early should you consider acquiring? And I wanted to just quickly say, you can acquire at any point. Sometimes individuals decide instead of starting a business, they're going to buy an existing business, and they can do that. You can look, you might have 2 employees and decide it's easy, you want to acquire. However, I want to hand it over to Eric or Yared just to quickly answer from a financial perspective. There are definitely some things that, a bank will look at that will help determine, is it too early or not for us to finance an acquisition? So, and sometimes that's infrastructure, sometimes that's past performance. I don't know, Eric, do you want to answer that, or Yared?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing is, we look at every situation on a case-by-case basis. So it is hard to generalize. I wouldn't say it's ever too early to buy a business. You don't have to have an existing business in order to buy a business. That being said, even if you have an existing business, that doesn't mean it's the right time to buy a business. It really just depends on a lot of factors. And actually, the next few slides will, I think, go into some of that. So I think that should help answer, or at least partially answer the question. But what I do encourage you to do is, after this webinar, reach out to us. We can have a more detailed conversation about your specific circumstances, what the nature of the business is that you're considering purchasing, and we'll give you our feedback in terms of if we think it's a good time. There are going to be things like, the amount of capital you have available, obviously the nature, what kind of business are we talking about? How long has that target business been in operation? So that, it really just is unique, I think, to the situation. There's no hard and fast rules here where, you have to have been in business for a certain number of years. There are things that help, though. If you have experience in the industry, that's always a benefit. If you do have, equity to put down, that's always going to be helpful. Collateral. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about these things on the next few slides, and I think that'll help clarify what I'm referring to here. But hopefully that gives you, just an initial baseline to think about. But yeah, please reach out after the webinar. We'd love to talk and see, how we might be able to help. The last thing I was going to say, just with respect to this slide, though, is if we get to the point, of course, you're through due diligence. The really the last step is closing the loan, closing the deal, and there's a lot of steps involved in closing. It's actually the longest part of the lending. I'd say once you're, once you found a business and we're actually ready to submit a deal to underwriting, closing is the part that takes the longest. There's just a lot of steps involved. And of course, if we get to that point, our closer would send a detailed checklist over, with an overview of what all of those steps are. But this is if there's real estate involved, there's title and surveys that have to be completed, inspections. So that's of course something we can talk about in more detail offline if you want to get a better understanding of how closing might look like for you. But that's really, in a nutshell, and of course at a high level, what the loan process would look like from the very front first step in terms of getting a solid team in place to actually closing the deal and buying a business. In terms of, next slide, Amber, please. In terms of the actual loan terms, what does the loan look like? So there's a lot of flexibility here. This is just a snapshot, and there's a couple of caveats I'll go through here, but the loan amounts can go all the way up to 5 million. It says 200K here. That's sort of a floor that we put. I'll actually say that we could potentially go lower than that. We tend to, once we start getting below that number, it's not to say we can't do it, but there might be some more collaboration that we would rely on, where we might refer you to a lending partner or bring in another institution that we've partnered with. I don't want to say we have a minimum loan amount. That's not the case, but as we get further and further below that 200K level, it just becomes, perhaps the best way to put it is it's less likely we would be able to do the loan. The $5 million cap, that's an SBA cap. That's not a Live Oak Bank limit. And the term here, it is 10 years, but one thing to note is if the deal includes any kind of commercial real estate, we could actually go above that 10-year term. And it's on a blended basis. So depending on the amount, if there is real estate involved, depending on the amount of the real estate versus the rest of what the loan amount would be, which would, primarily be the purchase price of the business. And that's typically a function of earnings or a multiple of earnings. Depending on that breakdown between the real estate piece and then the rest, that will impact what the term is. But we can go above 10 years. 10 years is really what the limit would be if there's no real estate involved. And then in terms of the timeline, it says 60 days on average. This is really going to be dependent on the specific transaction. It's going to be dependent on how quickly we get documents, how quickly the seller responds to what we need from them and their team. But on average, you can expect anywhere from, I'd say 60 to 90 days is the range I would give. Doesn't mean we can't do it quicker, and it doesn't mean it won't take longer, but that's just in terms of setting expectations. That's an accurate range to go off of. And then in terms of the interest rate, I will say the SBA does have different interest rate caps depending on the loan size. For the purposes of what we're talking about today and the loan amounts that we're talking about, the max interest rate that you would pay is prime, and I should say prime today as of December 1st, 2021 is 3.25%. The max rate would be prime plus 2.75. That's the max spread that any SBA 7A lender can charge currently based off the current rules. So that's to say that as of today, the max interest rate would be 6%. Now, keep in mind, that's a variable. And so there are fixed rate options if that's something someone would be interested in. The disclaimer with that is if you opted for a fixed interest rate, you would actually be it would be higher than that 6%. So the rates that I'm throwing out in terms of the prime plus 2.75, that's really just for the variable option. But again, we can talk more about these details offline if you did want to get some more details about pricing. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of what makes someone a good borrower or a good candidate, I want to just go through how the bank approaches evaluating that. And you can see on the slide, here are some factors that we look at just as part of initially qualifying a potential borrower. And I mean, some of these speak for themselves. I do want to clarify though that for example, if you look at the second to last bullet point, the 200K personal equity or assets, that doesn't mean that if you have less than that we won't do a loan or consider a loan or won't talk to you. And that brings up the broader point that I want to make related to this slide is there are multiple factors we look at, and there's no one single factor that we're going to, if you're not, perfectly in line with what the preference is or what the general cutoff is. So, 200K, we're going to look at the totality of circumstances. And so that means that if you have less than 200K, but you have a strong credit score and you have outstanding strategy or ownership or experience in this particular industry, or a very manageable personal debt service, it doesn't mean we're not going to consider the loan. So I really want to stress that. I can't stress that enough. And the reason I say this is I don't want someone who's listening on the webinar today to see this and think, oh, well, I don't have that, or I don't meet that requirement. So there's no hope for me. That's absolutely not the case. And by the way, I should add, even if Live Oak can't do the loan for whatever the reason might be, we could likely refer you or put you in touch with one of our partners who might be able to help. So we still want to have that conversation and see, you know, if we can help. But, you know, just back to the specific bullet points you see here, in terms of credit score, we do prefer to see credit scores above 700. I would also add, and it's not specifically outlined here, but we prefer there's no recent bankruptcies. I would say if there's a bankruptcy in the last 5 years, that does make it challenging for us to make the loan. But here, if you're going to take away one thing from this slide, it's even if there is a bankruptcy, even if a credit score is below 700, even if you don't have, you know, 200K in personal assets, if there is an understandable story, namely in the case of a bankruptcy or a less than stellar credit score, if there is an understandable story for why there may have been a bankruptcy, that gets us comfortable with, you know, the reason for that, then we can likely move forward. And we just recently closed a deal last month for a woman-owned small business. It was a daycare where there was a bankruptcy. It was 20 years ago. And there was a story that, you know, while unfortunate, you know, we felt comfortable moving forward because the owner just walked us through the background and got us comfortable with it. So, you know, all is not lost if you know, you don't have perfect qualification criteria through each bullet point. That's really not what we look for. So next slide, please.
Okay. And then I just want to add, we can evaluate this. Sorry, I'm reading the title, but there's also a question we can answer now or maybe in the next slide, but question from Urban Chamber is, can we purchase more than one firm at a time? How many total companies can we have under acquisition in our portfolio? So you can answer in this slide or maybe the next one.
Okay. So yes, it is possible to purchase more than one company. I mean, really, at the end of the day, a company is just really a legal entity, right? And there isn't really a cap per se in terms of the number of companies. The more important thing to keep in mind is really the size of the business. And one of the things that I didn't mention, but namely because it doesn't really come up in the world of 7A loans very often, but the size standards are something I should mention here, where in order to qualify for an SBA 7A loan, the business needs to be considered a small business. And it's very rare that that's not the case. You know, publicly traded companies aren't taking 7A loans out to conduct, you know, M&A activity. But that's probably the most important consideration, I would say, that's going to come into play that might sway the needle. It might dictate whether we could or couldn't do the loan. So it's not that, you know, you're buying 2 or 3 or 4 businesses. It's when combining all of those, however many businesses it is, does that constitute a business that is other than small? That's really probably the most important.
And I think we can talk individually with folks if they're they have interested in multiple. I mean, I will say this, there's a lot of time that goes into doing an acquisition. So I think a lot of folks think, oh, it'd be great if I can buy 3 or 4 companies at once. But when you start doing one, you realize the time and energy that goes into it. And you usually, you know, from a financial perspective, a bank wants to see, you know, success. So if you're looking to do 3 at once and you've never done an acquisition, we'd want to kind of understand how you handle that acquisition as well. So I think that's something we can talk through if you have a situation where you have a portfolio of companies. I know we're at the halfway point and we've got a lot of slides left, so we'll continue to try to answer questions, but any of these, you know, specific, we can also set up one-on-ones after this to kind of go through them.
Great. So yeah, these are my last few slides before I turn it over to Jared to continue to walk through the 7A program, and he'll go through some of the advantages of the program as well. But just to round it out here and build on the last slide, you might have encountered this before, but it's really important for every business owner out there, whether you're considering buying a business or just applying for a loan in general. It doesn't even have to be for buying a business necessarily. But the 5 C's of credit are really the foundation of what our credit team is going to base their decision off of. And just very briefly, character, pretty straightforward, but this is where we're going to look at just your personal integrity. We're going to want to meet you, if not face to face. But yeah, for the sake of character, the bank likes to say we want to work with borrowers who have the eye of the tiger. That's the saying we have at the bank. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into that, but I'll just go through these, and if you have more questions on specific elements within these that we're going to look at, happy to have a more detailed conversation after the webinar. Please don't hesitate to reach out. In terms of cash flow, this is sometimes used interchangeably with capacity, but it's really the ability of the business and borrower to pay back the debt. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as it relates to how we measure that. Collateral is basically a secondary source of repayment. So I should mention how the 7A program is really a cash flow based lending program, and Live Oak primarily is a cash flow based lender. That means that the first and most important thing we're looking at when qualifying a borrower is the business. Does the business cash flow, meaning does the business produce enough income to cover the debt and then some? And we'll talk a little bit about what that means on the next couple of slides. But collateral is accounting, beyond moving past that, because sometimes businesses have down years. Obviously, again, COVID, can come out of the blue, and then collateral becomes a secondary source of repayment. I will say that's not as critical, and that's one of the benefits of the 7A program. There's less stringent collateral requirements when compared to, say, a conventional loan. But that's collateral in a nutshell. In terms of conditions, that's typically just it's sort of a catch-all. It's once we factored it into the decision, the other 4 items you see here, conditions are going to include things like the broader economic circumstances, the local market, going to also include our understanding of some of the qualitative factors of the business, the employees, the culture. Really, that's why I call it a catch-all. All of the other factors that weigh into the decision of, will this succeed? Will this business be able to thrive? Capital is going to tie back to what can the owner put in terms of a meaningful equity contribution. And again, this really serves as the foundation for our credit team when they take a look at a deal. This is what they're using as their foundational lens to evaluate the credit worthiness of a borrower. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is just it ties back to the cash flow, or I also mentioned it can be interchangeably used with capacity. Really, this is debt service coverage. This is the primary way that we measure the ability of a business to pay back a loan. And so, of course, we start with the cash flow of the business, and then we're going to start factoring in all of the different expenses that a business has to cover. So, of course, that's rent. If there's rent, there's, of course, taxes, wages, et cetera. And Amber, if you could go to the next slide. This is known as the debt service coverage ratio. And I should mention how SBA has a requirement for businesses to have a 1.15 debt service coverage ratio. Live Oak has a slightly more conservative number of 1.25 or 1.3. What that means is for every dollar of debt, we want to see $1.30 of cash flow. And when we say cash flow, it's a little bit nuanced. It's not just profit, because there are add backs. And when I say add backs, that includes, for example, if you're buying a business which includes real estate, but you're currently paying rent, well, that rent is going away because you're now buying a location. So we would add that rent back into it, and that there's a number of different add backs, non-cash expenses like depreciation or amortization. We would add that back in. So it's sort of a profit plus add backs number, and when you take that number, we want to have for every dollar of debt at least $1.30 of that cash flow. And of course, the higher the number, the better. If you're below 1, it means the business doesn't have enough cash flow to cover what the debt would be. So we can talk more about this, for a specific business offline. But this is probably the most important thing, just in terms of measuring the ability of a business to pay back debt. This is the most important metric that we zero in on. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Erin, and he's going to just walk through a little bit more about the 7(a) program and take it from there.
Thank you, Eric. I want to start talking a little bit more about collateral. This is the second key factor in the decision to authorize a loan. Decisions regarding collateral or what's collateral to take are based on the circumstances of each individual loan request. So, and that could be the loan amount or the purpose of the loan. So we'll examine what collateral is needed just based on the circumstances. And so one key aspect to explain here is that any loan, any 7(a) loan over $350,000 must be fully secured with collateral that is either present in the business or in the personal assets of the guarantor or the new business owner. So SBA has a collateral valuation schedule that we use that explains what the net book value of the asset is and the discounted percentage that we apply to that asset. For example, for real estate, we consider no more than 85% of the fair market value of that property. That's a key. It's a key. Property and personal real estate is a key backstop to being able to fully secure a loan when the business doesn't have the assets in-house to secure that loan. Some SBA loans, and this doesn't really apply to a business acquisition very much, but some SBA loans do not require the loan to be fully secured. And one scenario may be a line of credit. And if the SBA loan is lower than $350,000, then it won't necessarily need to be fully secured. But in most cases, when we're talking about a business acquisition, that loan will have to be fully secured. And we can talk through what that means for you and how to get through the transaction. Let's go to the next slide. So the money down, so the minimum for SBA loans on a business acquisition is 10%. And that's 10% of the project cost, not 10% of the loan. And so the project cost would include transaction costs that are needed to get the loan approved. Consider using your network to help raise the funds needed to put money down on the loan. And from the SBA's perspective, 5% of that 10% must come from the buyer. Now, there's other options for that other 5%. It could be seller financing. And we are working on building a network of investors that could help assist with investing in your business acquisition. And we're happy to talk through that if we can set up a meeting one-on-one. Some of the advantages of the SBA loan are the lower interest rates, longer payback periods, less money down, and flexible uses of proceeds. The short list of key eligibility requirements are there on the screen. As you can see, our experienced team will review your loan request and assess eligibility early on in the process. Next slide. Some of the benefits here again for SBA lending is the competitive bank rates, long terms. The 25-year term is typically used for property acquisitions. And the uses of proceeds, as you can see on the right-hand side, include a list of different uses that one loan could be applied for. Typically, we've seen acquisitions that include real estate or inventory and other assets. So we're able to craft a loan structure that makes sense for the particular circumstances. Next slide. So this is our process overall. We'll start first with connecting to one of the members of the team on this webinar at the moment. We'll review your loan application, evaluate some of the things we talked about on this in this webinar, cash flow, collateral, et cetera. And if we can get past that stage, we'll get into underwriting. The underwriter will handle your loan, go through the due diligence stage. We'll have a credit review. after due diligence is completed. And once credit approves the loan, we'll get into closing, and then servicing would be the stage post-closing. We can go to the next slide. And so overall, we measure our success by yours. One of the things, we are the #1 SBA lender, and that's because we focus on the customer first. And let's go to the next slide. We can get into some more detail there. As the #1 SBA lender, we're the #1 SBA lender in the country. We have a ton of experience, decades of experience across the entire lending apparatus, from loan officer to credit officer to closer, which helps us get deals done in compliance and timely. In addition to that, we don't have commission, so our lenders are incentivized to do deals that are a win-win for both the bank and the customer. And we also hire expertise from the different industries we lend to help us understand our credit risk and our upside and do a better job lending to our customers. And we've been a trusted partner on thousands of transactions over the years. And, we're here to help you acquire a business when the time comes.
So oftentimes, and I'll be quick with this, I know most of you on this are usually buyers looking to potentially buy a business, but oftentimes we also have sellers that want to transition wealth, whether it's to a family member or someone in the neighborhood or their community, that they want to keep the business in that community. So we wanted to touch on this, and happy to have a conversation with anyone who is looking to sell and wants to understand how they might have a buyer in mind, leverage that SBA loan, and we can talk to that potential buyer as well. But things to consider when you're selling your business: determine the timing of your exit and the price range you'd be happy with. If you haven't talked to a wealth manager or someone that is looking at your retirement, you want to know what that goal is. And oftentimes with small businesses, I usually say you should understand what your business is worth on an annual basis, because you never know when you might have to exit. It could be a health issue. It could be you're ready for retirement. It could be you're just ready to do something new. So really understanding the tax implications, what you need for retirement, and talking to professionals about that is really important. And in certain situations, you're going to want a sell-side advisor and an attorney. And one thing I do mention is, if you have an heart issue, you don't go to your normal doctor. You usually go, and you need heart surgery, you go to a heart surgeon. The same is true when you're looking at some of these transactions. You want folks, attorneys and advisors that understand how to do acquisitions, so they can represent you well as you look to potentially sell that business. But happy to have a conversation and give background on any of that as well, if it's helpful. And when is the best time to sell? Oftentimes when the questions above are answered, if you just want contracts or purchase orders, either commercial or government, that backlog is going to make the value of your company higher. And as a buyer, you want to buy a company that has, backlog, the more reoccurring revenues. So something to think about on both sides. And when anyone can buy your company, and there's a good understanding that there will be multiple buyers, because, it really is determined by the marketplace. And if there's only one person that is interested or could buy you, that price is going to be determined by that one person. So just some things to consider. And then how do you value a business? This is important both for if you're selling your firm, but even just as important or more important for those that are looking to buy a firm, because you don't want to buy a firm that is too expensive or for too much. And a bank obviously will help with that, because we'll help lay out what you could, what you could buy for and what would make sense from the pricing perspective. But generally, the valuation is determined by EBITDA. So what is the EBITDA of your firm? EBITDA is operating profit plus depreciation plus amortization. And this is a number that either you, your accountant, your financial person within your firm should be looking at least on an annual basis. Whether you're looking to buy or sell your firm, this is going to determine the worth of that. And then there's usually a multiple that's associated. So it could be 2 times EBITDA or 3 times EBITDA or 4 times EBITDA, depending on the marketplace. Sometimes it's 1.5 times EBITDA, but in the small business space, we usually don't see above 5. It's usually kind of in a pretty realistic range, unless there's a technology or something else. But for just a pure small business, you're looking at a multiple of EBITDA. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're looking to value your firm, or you're looking to value a firm that you're looking to buy.
All right. So I just, before we concluded, we just wanted to quickly run through what a loan example might look like. Of course, loans are going to take many different shapes and sizes. It's going to depend on the purchase price, the length of the payback period, but just to give you a flavor of what a $5 million loan, this would be a large loan. This would be the max size that the program permits. But just to give you a sense of the use of proceeds breakdown, in this case, the loan includes real estate. Keep in mind, if the loan does not include real estate, that will impact the payback period, the max payback period. So because of that real estate component here, it allows us to have a longer payback period. And of course, that is going to impact the monthly payment of the loan. So just to give you some numbers here, we have the loan term, you see it's a $5 million term or $5 million loan with a 15 to 25 year term. So just to give you some numbers in terms of the monthly payment, if it was a 15-year payback period here, the monthly payment on that would be approximately $41,000. So remember what I said about the debt service coverage. We would basically take that number, multiply it by 12, and then we'd want to see that cash flow, that adjusted cash flow number, basically multiply the debt service by 12 to get the annual debt service, and then multiply that by 1.3. And that's sort of the minimum adjusted cash flow we're going to want to see to make sure the business has the capacity to pay the loan back. If it was a 25-year term, that would have a monthly payment of approximately $31,000. So as you can see, depending on how long of a payback period you're going to have, that can, pretty significantly impact the actual monthly payment. The numbers that I just gave you, I was using, just for example's sake, a 5.5% interest. That's prime plus 2.25. One note to make here is that the interest rate is really going to be dependent on the specific risk profile of the deal. So a lot of times we get asked quite early because, and it's a good thing for owners who are considering acquisition to be doing, they're shopping around, talking to multiple banks, but early in the process, we will get asked, what's your interest rate? And until we're really able to get into the weeds and look at the risk profile of the deal and understand, if you've even identified a seller yet, if you've identified a business to approach to purchase, all of those things are going to weigh into what that interest rate will be. So it's difficult for us to give an interest rate quote early on in the process and without some of that really critical information that allows us to have a more informed basis of the risk of the deal. But that's why I always start with the max interest rate, just to be as conservative as possible. It's not going to be any more than prime plus 2.75. So this just gives you a good breakdown of a particular deal, but of course it's going to vary from loan to loan, from business to business. So that is the presentation. We do have some links here that you can follow to our website that go into some elements of our aspects of our process in more detail. There's some examples in there as well. But yeah, it's been a pleasure, and we really hope to be able to connect with most of you offline and walk through some of these opportunities, specific opportunities you might be looking at in more detail.
Wow. Thank you all for delivering what is a very impactful presentation. I do have a couple of questions on behalf of some of our member businesses now. We do have a wide range of different businesses. Some, are just starting up. They're startups, and then some have been in existence for over a couple of decades. But I'm thinking about those businesses that are in our network that are more asset light. They're technology based, and they're centered around the people, their systems and processes. If you were looking to sell or buy, if you're looking to sell or buy an asset light asset, or one of those types of assets, how would you all evaluate from a live oak bank perspective? How do you evaluate those types of assets?
I think you're asking the question to the right group of people, because we didn't go into intros just because we had sent that out ahead of time. But one thing I should note is the entire team who spoke today, we all have a government contracting background. And so I used to work at the Food and Drug Administration. Actually, Yared and I were colleagues there in a previous life before we joined the bank. We were contracting officers over there. The reason I make the point and bring this up is the bank actually has a government contracting background. Yared mentioned how one of the defining characteristics of the bank is we have a really deep commitment to industry expertise, and we hire industry experts to staff the various industry teams. Our team that spoke today is a little unique in that we're industry agnostic, but the main point I'm making is that, and I'm just using government contracting as an example because typically those types of businesses are asset light. They are typically service providers who really drive value by their staff and the services that they provide for the federal government. Could also be state and local government clients too. But in those cases, we definitely have a lot of M&A activity, and this is really the heart of the answer to the question. We evaluate the strength of the contracts, really the strength of the revenue. So, the way that you're going to be paying the loan back for those kinds of businesses it's through the contracts and the revenue associated with those contracts. So of course, we view those contracts as assets, even though they're not really assets in the conventional sense, right? You can't, liquidate that asset or sell it, on the secondary market somewhere. So, there's obviously some unique characteristics there, but my point is we absolutely make loans to those kinds of businesses if we can get comfortable with the source of the revenue. If we have comfort in faith in that, whether it's the federal government or a really strong long-time customer who keeps renewing their contract, that's absolutely possible for us to get comfortable with that, even in the case of there not being a lot of assets. So I'm using government contracting as an example just because this is a very common issue that we run into, but we still are able to get deals done that way. So,
and I think Eric, just to that point, we get this question because I know you do have members that are government contractors. Their asset purchases and their stock purchases. The majority of what we end up doing are stock purchases. But if you have a carve out of a business, a certain vehicle, or a certain area, you do have to novate those contracts. So we take that into account when we look at the risk and we look at kind of size and NAICS, but we can look at either one. To Eric's point, we do more of those stock purchases across all of our industries, and also quite frankly in the GovCon side of things. But definitely the contracts are kind of what make up that reoccurring revenue.
Okay, and perfect. That sort of leads into this next question. I know early on, Eric, you mentioned that you take a look at the financial statements, the balance sheet, income statements. I didn't catch how many years worth of financials that you look at, and then also when you're reviewing those contracts, what do you look for in terms of duration? Do the contracts need to be 5 years or greater, three to 5 years or greater? What does that look like in order for a deal to be successful?
Yeah,
or
so
viewed as less risky? I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I would say for the first part of the question, so we asked for 3 years worth of financials. So technically I would say 3+ because we'll ask for the last 3 years of tax returns. And of course, there's always a transitional phase because depending on where we are in a given year, the most recent tax year may not have been filed yet, or they're on extension. So in that case, let's just assume you're a business, you haven't filed your 2020 tax returns yet, even though I think at this point in the year, that's, everyone should have filed their 2020 tax returns. But let's just use, for example's sake, if you haven't, we'll ask for 2017, 18, and 19, and then we'll ask for your financials, interim financials for 2020 in lieu of your submitted tax returns. But generally it's 3 years. And then the reason I say 3+ is whatever year we're in. So of course, no one's filed their 2021 tax returns yet. We'll ask for interim financials for the current year that we're in. So that's the plus part. But yeah, generally it's 3 years. And then with respect to the thing that we look, or the things that we look at for contracts, is there like a minimum timeline? I wouldn't say there's a minimum. I mean, obviously, the longer the duration of the contract, the stronger that will present, the stronger, you know, the deal will look for us as lenders, our credit team, the underwriting team. But you know, keep in mind, to keep the government contracting example going, by and large, those contracts, even if it's a 5-year contract, it's really a 12-month contract with 4 option years. That's the more common structure of a government contract. So in those cases, we're looking at, you know, is it a brand new contract? Is this a case where, you know, the business is an incumbent and they've had a long history of winning that work? Are they in year, you know, 4 of a 5-year contract? Are they in year 1? You know, so it really depends. But I would not say there's a cutoff where, you know, if it's a 1-year contract or there's, you know, 2 years left out of 5 years, you know, we're not going to do the deal. But of course, it's really more of a spectrum, and we have a pretty detailed approach when we're looking at contracts. You know, to use the government contracting example, we have a pretty detailed approach in terms of how we assess the risk of a contract. We'll also look at concentration risk. You know, is all of the revenue tied to one customer, or is it spread out? So it's not just one thing. It's never just one thing. And Yurid or any of the others on the team, I don't know if you want to add to that, but.
The only thing I just wanted to add is I've seen some comments of people wondering how can we contact Live Oak Bank to get started in the process. So I just want to reiterate, our emails are up on this slide, so please contact. I would definitely encourage contacting Yurid or Eric to get the process going. However, Erin and myself were also available to help connect you.
And I think final question, will link to this recording of the webinar be available? And I think, Phil, we can hand it back to you because we're right at the 3 o'clock mark. And really appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone who joined us. We're eager to, you know, jump in and talk with you and learn how we can support your business going forward. But I don't know, Phil, if you want to finish off and just give it information on how everyone can receive a link to this.
Yes, perfect. Immediately after this airing, I'm going to follow up with just a quick follow-up email thanking you all for attending. And then a couple of days from now, we're going to have this recording placed on our YouTube site and our webpage. So all of the folks who attended, and for those folks who could not attend, we will make sure to have this available to them. We'll also have sort of a mini watch party over the holidays for folks that have a little bit of time to view this recording. So we'll make sure to put that up as well. Now, I want to thank you, Eric, Erin, Yurid, Amber. You all were amazing. And again, we want to thank you again and welcome you into the USBC family as our newest partners. And on behalf of our president, Ron Busby, our board, and our staff, I want to thank all of our attendees for tuning in today and for asking your very thoughtful questions and for bringing your company-specific questions to this event as well. We will make sure to have all the contact information available to the folks that are going to have their questions to follow up with. So definitely appreciate you all. And I want to thank you again for tuning in to USBC.